This video has been in the works for a very long time. Early last year, Too Many Minis put out a video asking the question of what is next for the Middle-earth strategy battle game. At the time, I was still very new into the hobby, and when I saw his video initially, I was overcome with excitement. The rumors that were circulating, the things that people were hoping for, the speculations, was all a buzz for me, being so fresh. Almost immediately after I finished watching the video, I started typing out the script to this video, and over the course of the next almost a year, I would put it together, which is what you're watching now. It is only slightly ironic that this video is finally coming out with the expectation that at Adeptacon 2024, we will finally get some inkling as to what the next steps for MESBG will be. And as a preamble, I am nothing if not overly excited for the potential of what is to come. I've been immersed in Tolkien's world and works since I was 6 years old, when my father sat me and my little brother down to watch the animated Lord of the Rings movies in lieu of Peter Jackson's release of Fellowship of the Ring, the first in a trilogy unlike any trilogy that ever was or will be. It was incredible. The aesthetic and the designs and everything of those animated movies carried me into the live-action movies with such love for fantasy and storytelling and the genre as a whole that I've never been able to pull myself out. I tell you all of this not only to incite the prompt of today's video, but also to articulate to everyone that I do have a great deal of investment in Lord of the Rings. I am still very new to MESBG, despite what the collection on the table might suggest to you. I'm still learning the rules, I'm still playing small games with Kat, I'm still fighting every urge to buy so many different things from Games Workshop and stuff that I found on Amazon that may or may not be out of print at this moment, but I'm still very new to the hobby. That doesn't stop my mind from creating different things based off inspirations from more veteran members of the community. I really want to play on Zorpazorp's Minas Tirith board. I want to build a Gondor army and a Black Númenórean army thanks to 3D Games and Windrush Wargaming respectively. Anders Talks Hobbies, Too Many Minis are basically the impetuses for the idea that I'm about to go on an extended diatribe with you about today. And that's not to mention the myriad of other creators that have also contributed to my investment from a community side of things when it comes to this hobby. So today I want to engage in a little bit of wishful thinking and answer Too Many Minis' question of what's next for MESBG and why I think it should be the War with Angmar. So why the War with Angmar? The War with Angmar is one of those smaller bits of lore that's never really referenced quite as heavily as I really feel that it should be, considering the far-reaching ramifications that it has for the narrative in general. First asking the questions of like, who's the Witch King of Angmar? What is Angmar? Where did these things come from? What did they do? Who are the Rangers of the Dunedain? Where did they come from? All of these things feed into the questions surrounding what happens during the War with Angmar. It's actually a pretty pivotal moment in Lord of the Rings history. And it's not like we've never seen the War with Angmar ever adapted in any way, shape, or form. We've had references to it in the Hobbit series, we've had reference to it in Lord of the Rings Online, and most notably, we've had references to it in one of my favorite games of all time, The Battle for Middle-earth. When Dee and I were very young, Battle for Middle-earth was the game that we had played at a friend's house and we had begged our parents so fervently to get our hands on. We played the heck out of this game. And we would continue to play the heck out of this game much into our adulthood, basically trading back the one laptop that we had between the two of us that could run this game and that we had the, the keys downloaded onto. The expansion that we played the most was obviously the expansion for Battle for Middle-earth 2 called Rise of the Witch King, which introduces Angmar as its own playable faction with new units and new powers and a whole new campaign, which, in the extended diatribe to follow about what I would like to see in an MESBG War with Angmar supplement, I will be making quite a few allusions to stuff that was in this game because I think this is a really good template to go off of. I want to get ahead of the idea that I just want to see this in, a tabletop format. That's not entirely true. However, what I will admit to is the reason why I have so much Star Wars Legion is because I want to play Battlefront 2, the original one that came out on the PlayStation 2, on the tabletop. The reason why I have a bunch of MESBG is because I want to play Battle for Middle-earth and Conquest on the tabletop. All of our hobbies as adults are just extensions of all the things that we wish that we could have done as children. But I know at this point you're probably asking one major question, and that's not what is next for the Middle-earth strategy battle game, but what even is the War with Angmar? Now I will tell you, audience, one thing that I think Tolkien did very well was that every single side story that he added to the lore of the Legendarium helped to impact and build upon the greater narrative of the Lord of the Rings, which is something that I, as a writer, am constantly battling and struggling with how I can emulate in my own craft. I'm just going to go over the basics of the War with Angmar. If you want more specific details about what happened, I'm going to link Men of the West and Nerd of the Rings' videos in the description below. Everything that they do is bite-sized, and so for our TikTok-abused brains, it's much easier to comprehend, in my opinion. Let's get into the overview. During the Third Age of Middle-earth, the Kingdom of Arnor, which is one of the two successor kingdoms to the High Kingdom of Numenor, came under attack from their fallen cousins to the north, the Black Numenorians of Angmar. This conflict lasted from 1300 Third Age all the way to 1975 in the Third Age. Over 600 years. It got so bad that the elves of Rivendell and Lindon had to get involved twice! And even Gondor had to come to their aid. Gondor! At the end of the war, in an epic final climactic battle, the forces of Angmar were defeated by the combined forces of what remained of the Arnorian peoples, Gondor, Lindon, and Rivendell, driving them back into the frozen north. It was also at this time that they realized that the leader and puppet master of this entire prolonged campaign was in fact the Witch King of Angmar, a servant of the Dark Lord who would survive this war to go and serve his Dark Master later on in, oh, I don't know, the plot? Something that would come from the end of this campaign and the end of this war would be the creation of the Dunedain tribes, the group of people that Aragorn comes from, which is in fact the remnants of the Arnorian people taking a new name as they took to a new nomadic life of ranging in the wilds of what was once their home. Additionally, the Shire was established, which was a deal that was worked out between one of the last kings of Arnor and the leadership of what would become the Shire for aid for the hobbits helping the Dunedain and the Arnorians in fighting back the forces of Angmar during this, again, 675-year-long campaign. Other notable instances in the war happen to be the sacking of the Watchtower of Almansul, more commonly known as Weathertop, the corrupting of the Barrow Downs, the sieges of the great cities of Fornost and Rivendell, and that one time that Glorfindel showed up to run all of the enemies back to Carn Dûm, the capital city of Angmar, and then say that that was plenty enough, and didn't finish the job. 675 years is a lot of material to work with. Melkor. Yes, you. Hello. We're talking about you. Well, we're talking about a servant of your servant. Now that we've got all of the context out of the way, we can get into the wishful thinking part of the video, where I basically exposit to you all the things that I would like to see and would expect to see in a supplement of the War with Angmar. Say hi, Melkor. So, Melkor and I are going to walk you guys through what we would want to see in a War with Angmar. This is going to be a completely subjective, completely opinionated piece. I'm making semi-unreasonable demands because it would require a large amount of work done on the production side of things that I don't think is really in the pipeline at this point in time. So the first and major thing that we need to talk about are going to be the factions that are going to be involved in this campaign that we are discussing. And obviously, if it's the War with Angmar, the two major players are going to be Angmar and Arnor. Now, the thing about that is that Angmar, of the two, is the most fleshed out of the factions. It has multiple different options for heroes. It has many different options when it comes to their unit types as well. Arnor, on the other hand, is woefully underrepresented in the current model range. And that is something that we have been struggling with for years, my friends. Like, that's not unknown. Frankly, I mean, it's really 4 pages in the Armies of Middle-earth book. So, we need to flesh this army out just a little bit. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to pretend that Arnor is going to get treated the same way that the Easterlings got treated in the Defense of the North, and they're just going to get a slew of new models to add to the range. Arnor is written to be run in a very specific way to echo the final stand of Arnor with Arvedui and the Seer character. To get the full scope and the breadth, we need to get this a little bit more fleshed out. So let's talk about Arnor, let's talk about the faction that currently exists, and let's talk about the faction we would like to see by the release of this campaign, the War with Angmar. This army may include Arvedui, the last king of Arnor, the Seer, a captain of Arnor, a warrior of Arnor, rangers of Arnor, and hobbit archers. Fantastic. Fairly straightforward, very small. Things that are missing is cavalry, very much so, a robust hero pool. It doesn't feel full enough. There's not enough interesting options. So I have some suggestions. We have one hero of valor, that being Arvedui, and then two heroes of fortitude, that being the Seer and the Captain. We do not have a hero of legend, and we do not have any minor heroes. There's nothing to continue to flesh out warbands. You're just relying on this specific moment, which is fine, but this campaign shows the entire arc is the idea. So to rely specifically on this final stand with such a meager amount of support in terms of heroes is something that we need to correct, in my opinion. So how do we correct that? Well, first and foremost, we have a couple of other named kings, at least 4 of them according to my notes, that have a fairly heavy role to play in this conflict. We have King Argaleb, Arvaleg, Arafor, and King Aravel. I see how eventually we got to Aragorn. I'm not saying that each of these kings we need to have all 4 of these kings represented. Would that be nice? Yes. It could be a situation where we kind of switch up their heroic actions that they have access to. Some of them might be able to do one thing over the other. Arvedui doesn't seem to really have a whole lot in the realm of war gear that he can take, so adding that facet to these kings, for instance, Arvaleg could have a horse. I'm thinking all of these kings should probably be heroes of valor in some way, shape, or form, just because they are going to be the major leaders of this faction over the course of this entire campaign. I don't specifically have an idea for a hero of legend. One of the kings would make the most sense. To choose one over the other to be the hero of legend of this faction, I'm not entirely sure if I would be willing to make that call. Maybe a couple weeks from now, I will feel differently. But for the time being, I'm thinking that the kings that I have mentioned previously should join Arvedui as heroes of valor in the faction. Now I'm going to close my book for just a second and kind of step a little bit higher on my soapbox, because this is the first hero that I would like to introduce to the faction that is being taken deliberately from another faction. That being a King of Men. The King of Men is a unnamed hero from the Minas Tirith or Gondor faction that you can take. The stat block is very nice. They have a variety of war gear that they can take. They have a couple very standard heroic actions that they can take. The importance of the King of Men is that for Arnor, this conflict that they have with Angmar persists over the course of 600 years. We only have 4 named kings over that span of time, in my notes at the very least. To have a model that can represent one of the unnamed kings, one of the unreferenced kings, who is constantly fighting border skirmishes, that seems like a no-brainer to me. The designer's notes of the King of Men even mentions that this being one of the unnamed kings, or potentially even a steward of Gondor, this makes way too much sense for it to just stay in the Minas Tirith faction, and I would love to see it in some fashion in Arnor. You get to name the king yourself, you get to have your own little, piece of lore for these 600 years. Personally, as someone who prides themselves on really deep diving the homebrewness of your faction, that's a no fucking brainer to me. Now moving on to the Heroes of Fortitude. Obviously, we already have a number of Heroes of Fortitude. By a number, I mean 2. The first hero of Fortitude I would like to add to the faction is going to be the Prince of Cardolan. Cardolan as a faction is something I would like to see present, no holds bar. So having the Prince of Cardolan specifically mounted, I think would be a very good opportunity here within this faction. And also, so we can get, finally, some cavalry in this faction. A couple more heroes of Fortitude that I would like to see flesh out the hero roster in Arnor. I would really like to see a hero character, something to the effect of a Warden of Fornost, Knight of Fornost, Knight of Arnor, something of the like. Fornost is the capital city and fortress of the whole kingdom of Arnor. So to have an individual whose entire prestige is similar to that of a Knight of the Tower or Citadel Guard or something of the like. Some sort of an imposing figure with a wicked-ass helmet and a billowing cape and a massive fuck-off sword. That's the kind of dude that I want standing in front of the gates. Yeah, I like that idea a lot. Let's talk about some ideas for minor heroes to add to the faction. I always like the idea of minor heroes. Their warbands are small and they can be more intimate. Warbands that you would put together for very specific tactical reasons. They're often very cheap, and so you can get multiples of them to fit multiple different tactic realms and scenarios within the game. I think we need a ranger captain. Other two minor heroes that I would like to introduce reference two of the sub-principalities of Arnor, that being Cardolan and Rudour. So I would think a minor hero could be a Knight of Cardolan. That being a minor hero, you can make them very cavalry-centric, but also make them very much in line with the idea of a Captain of Arnor, but very much specified. Similarly, I would also like to do a Captain of Rudour, specifically a Rudour Captain Loyalist. This is the way that we kind of have this split between the Rudouran Arnorians who joined Angmar and those very few who remained loyal to Arnor. In this way, I'm also wanting to make a reference to Azog's Legion from the Armies of the Hobbit book, where you can get goblin mercenaries, but a band of goblin mercenaries can only be led by a goblin mercenary captain. So you can only have Rudour loyalists in your army if they are led by a Rudour loyalist captain, adding some flavor and character and story elements to the army that I think is so very lacking. There are 3 units available for warriors in the Arnor faction. They are as follows: the Warrior of Arnor, the Ranger of Arnor, and as stated at the beginning, Hobbit Archers. That's all we got to work with. So we need to expand this just a touch. Just a little bit. So we're going to beg off that and bring in a few extra additions as we go. The major additions to this faction that I would like to make is in reference to the principalities that I've mentioned a couple times, that being Cardolan and Rudour. Rudour, very early on in the campaign, switches sides, betrays Arnor, and joins Angmar. So I'm thinking for the most part, Rudour is going to be very heavily in the Angmar camp. However, as I mentioned with the hero, I would like to see a loyalist splinter faction of Rudour, the individuals who were loyal to the king despite all of the craziness that was happening. Obviously, a majority of them joined Angmar, but those treasured few I would refer to as the loyalists. They would be led specifically by a loyalist captain, and then obviously since that is a minor hero, we're looking at smaller war bands of these guys, maximum of 6. They would more than likely have like big axes, I would think. They're more like guerrilla tactics kind of guys. They can probably team up very well. There's some synergy that could definitely happen in smaller army sizes with the Rangers of Arnor and the loyalist wildmen of Rudour. Holy shit, now that I'm thinking about that, I need that. I need that now, of a small army list of, say, 200 points, but specifically it is built of, like, a Ranger captain and a Rudour loyalist captain, and you've got your Rangers of Arnor and the Rudour loyalists, and probably some Shire archers thrown in there for good measure. That would be such a fun guerrilla tactics fight. Cardolan, on the other hand, is a little bit more steeped in tradition, it feels. With the access to the Barrow Downs, I would say we should probably see two kind of models come out of Cardolan. First and foremost being Cardolan Knights, mounted cavalry, for the love of God. Aside from the mounted knights, I would like to see a more ceremonial unit coming out of Cardolan, something similar to like the Fountain Guard, where they have heavy armor, they have pikes, that's it. That's pretty much it. So they're very good with support, not very good on their own. I think Phalanx, Cardolan Phalanx, seems like a very good piece. The Royal Guard of the King, being kind of like a more specialized elite unit of soldier, and then the Citizens of Arnor, kind of like a Survivors of Laketown vibe, just kind of your everyday Joe Schmo people who would be fighting against the tides of evil. Definitely something that is more thematic, that it is really, I guess, helpful, but they could probably have very high courage in the face of utter doom and around certain heroic characters and stuff like that. So that is my thoughts for Arnor as a more fleshed out faction. That's a faction that I would super be interested in building and frankly playing. I just think that that aesthetic would be very interesting, and to bring echoes of that theming and that narrative would be a lot of fun and capture a lot of players' hearts. But now, we gotta talk about Angmar. An army of Angmar may compose of the Witch King of Angmar, the Tainted, the Dwimmerlark, which is a badass name, the Terror of Arnor, the Troll Chieftain, the Shades, the Barrow Wight, Angmar Orc Captain and Angmar Orc Shaman, a Wild Warg Chieftain, Angmar Orcs, Angmar Warg Riders, Angmar Cave Trolls, Dead Marsh Specters, and the Wild Wargs of Angmar. This is already incredibly robust, and there's not a whole lot that I need to do. However, there are some aesthetics and some things that I would like to add. So let's talk about that. I know in my heart of hearts, I would like to replay the entire Angmar campaign from the Battle of Middle-earth to Rise of the Witch King DLC. But a lot of those characters already exist in some way, shape, or form to the characters that are presented here in the Angmar list. Namely, Morgamir, the right hand of the Witch King, could be either the Dwimmerlark or the Tainted. Morgamir is supposed to be a Nazgul. It's really not that deep. You can run Morgamir as either the Tainted or the Dwimmerlark. Rogash, the Troll Chieftain, is very similar, or would be very similar to the Troll Chieftain that they have access to. I like the look of Rogash with the big heavy armor and the big fuck-off sword, but I can live with that. The Terror of Arnor does not need to change. Does not need to change at all. He's great. The only thing that needs to change about him is that he needs to be available on the store. That's it. An addition that I would like to make, which is in reference both to the lore but also from the Battle for Middle-earth game, is a character who went by the name of Haldor. He could be referenced very simply as Fallen Rudour Chieftain. The idea of having Rudour, the traitorous sub-principality of Arnor, I think is something that this faction is missing, specifically surrounding this narrative that we are now trying to tell. So having a hero character, probably a hero of fortitude, a fallen chieftain of Rudour, I think would be a welcomed addition to this roster of heroes. There is a ranger who in the narrative, according to Battle for Middle-earth, dies and gets corrupted as a wraith enslaved to Angmar. We already have Shades and Barrow Wights. The only thing that either of them do not have is a really good range. So maybe introducing a spectral hero type character that has really good range in comparison to everybody else who does not, noticeably does not, would be cool. Another hero that I would like to introduce, more than likely an independent hero, would be a Cargul, which is basically a Nazgul, but rather than being in black, they're in red. And they have no melee whatsoever, they're just very specifically magic based. So having something that's a little bit more points cost than the Angmar Orc Shaman, and a little less points cost than either of the Nazgul, but still has a wealth of magic potential, I think would be a welcomed addition to the Angmar faction. And if they're an independent hero, then they can't take a warband, which would also kind of balance out them just being magical powerhouses, but not really having any assistance. A hero of fortitude, or a minor hero that I would like to see present in the faction to make way for units I would like to see in the faction, is a chieftain of Black Numenorians in Angmar. This is obviously a direct reference to the Battle for Middle-earth game, but you already knew that I'm making plenty of references to that game. The Black Numenorians is a fantastic, interesting concept. The Kingsmen and the splinter factions that took various places in Middle-earth, allegedly the Witch King is one of those individuals. The idea that there are Black Numenorians in Angmar would make so much sense. I would really, really, really like to see that, so we can get those Angmar-specific Black Numenorians. The aesthetic is just... it's so good in my head! Aside from that, I'm kind of drawing a blank on any other heroes. Again, it is so incredibly robust. These are all a very good roster. I think that there are just small additions that can be made specifically for the narrative and the campaign that we are trying to tell. Which leads to a very good segue to the units that we could add. I think this is very simple to talk about the units. Obviously, the first unit that I would like to see is Angmar Black Numenorians. That is it. Angmar Black Numenorians, enough said. And if we are adding a hero specifically for Hwaldar, the proverbial Rhudaur fallen chieftain, then we would want to see some Rhudaur fallen clansmen of some kind. I really don't see them needing really any major differences in comparison to the Loyalists. They would probably kind of be very similar to the Goblin Prowlers. Maybe a very similar like special rule where they can basically deep strike from somewhere in the map. Other than that, I don't really see a whole lot that needs to be added to Angmar at the moment. That pretty much covers Arnor and Angmar. Minas Tirith and Gondor already has such a robust list, and since the inclusion of the war in Gondor, they've got so much of a range to choose from. So really all they need to really kind of fit into the narrative is going to be Arnor, the last king of Gondor. And we will talk about why he was the last king of Gondor in the next segment when we talk about the campaign. But we do have to talk about the elves. Hi, welcome back. We're going to talk about the elves, your favorites, the descendants of the Noldor. He's here because we're going to talk about the elves. Oh, Bean. I say we need to talk about the elves as if we need to make some grandiose changes to their rosters in this campaign, and that's not entirely true. Just a couple additions that I would like to see. First and foremost is because Círdan the Shipwright does play a fairly major role in relieving the first siege of Fornost. The model we have for Círdan is cool, is fine. It's a good, I use it as a elven nobleman in my games of D&D from time to time. We probably need a Círdan who's a little bit more armored, a little bit more prepared for battle. We can keep the old model for Círdan because I think it's fine, but also just a more warrior-centric Círdan the Shipwright. Which is a great transition into the units that we need to add. Whew! I feel terrible having talked so much shit about Arnor only having 2 units. At least Rivendell has warriors and cavalry in comparison to what Arnor had. However, let's be a little inventive. I would like to add a unit to accompany Círdan the Shipwright to lift the siege of Fornost. And so these guys would be Shipwrights of Mithland. And in complete juxtaposition to the slender blades, the very elegant weapons of the Rivendell faction that already exist, these guys would have axes. Or maybe a halberd. That would be cool. We have not really seen axes reflected in the elven roster or lineup at all. So I think that would be a fun addition. So they have Círdan the Shipwright with his shipwrights soldiers coming to lift the siege of Fornost. Then we have to talk about Lothlorien During the War with Angmar, Lothlorien was simply known as Lorien, and the last king of Lorien was a guy by the name of Amroth. The only major addition that I would like to add to Lothlorien, because I think the roster is fleshed out enough, I think simply adding a hero of valor in the form of Amroth, I think would be a very welcomed addition to the Lorien roster, specifically for this campaign. Now for the actual campaign, I have about 20 scenarios here that I would like to see. They're going to be very base bones here because I don't want to be here for 3 hours discussing all the nuances and the lists that would be involved. The base templates are a great way to start thinking about how the scenario is going to work, but obviously you can do kind of whatever you want in the campaigns. They have their own specific objectives according to the scenario that you're playing. I'm just using those as templates to kind of get the mind thinking of like where we want this to go. The campaign we have planned here covers all 600 of those years from the formation of Angmar in the north to the dissolution of Arnor to Angmar's final end at the hands of a combined force of the last king of Gondor and the elves of Rivendell and Mithland. So, let's get into this. Scenario 1 is called the Formation of Angmar. It is the Witch King of Angmar and his forces clearing out the last vestiges of resistance in the territory that is Angmar so he can set up his foothold in that country. The playable factions are obviously going to be Arnor and Angmar. This would be a kind of storm the camp scenario out of the main book where the entire point is that Angmar is trying to push Arnor out off the board edge, where Arnor is trying to basically hold back the tide of the shadow that is encroaching in on this territory. Scenario 2 is the Fall of Rudor, the Betrayal of Rudar. As has been mentioned, Arnor has 3 main principalities. We have Arthedain, you have Cardolan, and then you have Rudaur. Rudaur falls to the influence of Angmar thanks to a particular high chieftain of the Rudar. We're thinking something to the effect of the High King trying to basically make his way from one end of the board to the next to escape while he is attacked on both flanks by a surprise attack featuring the forces of Angmar and the now fallen men of Rudar. In the lore, Argaleb doesn't make it out of this, so having victory points surrounding that for either side is ideal. Scenario 3 is Push Them Back to the Hills. For the first time in this campaign, in Scenario 3, we will be introducing our next new faction, that being Rivendell, with the inclusion of Círdan and his small band of forces that are assisting the Arnorian troops in pushing Angmar back to the Weather Hills. That kind of holds them back for a time. It is the fortification of the Weather Hills, the creation of Amon Sul, Weathertop, as a natural barrier against the forces of Angmar and the fallen men of Rudaur. So the template that we're looking at is going to be Domination, Lords of Battle, and Capture and Control. Scenario 4 is the Siege of Rivendell. Arnor has created a very solid defensive fortification structure kind of situation. So the Witch King turns its attention to Rivendell, and this is one of the first times and only times, I'd like to say, that Rivendell is actively sieged. So in this we are going to see obviously Angmar, because they're doing the heavy lifting in terms of the evil factions here, and then we are going to see Rivendell taking part in this. And this is going to be our first siege of this campaign, which is going to have a couple. Scenario 5 is Battle Among the Barrow Downs. Cardolan is very well known for the Barrow Downs, the tombs of the ancient kings of Arnor. So this particular scenario articulates the period of time where Angmar invades Cardolan, looking to kind of desecrate the Barrow Downs, corrupting those sacred shrines of these ancient kings into greater fodder and foot soldiers for the forces of Angmar. Obvious factions here are going to be Angmar and Arnor, with a heavy emphasis on the Cardolan side of the faction, as well as the Rangers. And a template for this one is going to be kind of falling in line with Capture and Control, as well as some elements of To the Death. And now the first of a two-parter scenario. It's going to be 2 separate scenarios in my head, but it's all kind of a single encounter. So scenario 6 is going to be the sacking of Amon Sul. This is years after the Weather Hills are fortified. Angmar returns, this time attacking the fortress tower of Amon Sul, or better known as Weathertop, with the intention of stealing the Palantir. Angmar versus Arnor. There's a few different templates that we can work with here, but the main ones that I enjoy are Seize the Prize and Heirloom of Ages Past. I really like the idea that there are multiple different objectives on the board, and neither one of the players know exactly which objective is the objective that they need. They have to go to it, interact with it, flip it over. Obviously, the prize here, the heirloom, is going to be the Palantir. It is going to be Angmar basically trying to secure the Palantir and then hold out, whereas Arnor, once they get their hands on the Palantir, they're going to want to retreat. Scenario 7 is more or less the last stand of the Prince of Cardolan. This is a very iconic moment where the Prince of Cardolan defends the king's rear as he flees with the Palantir. If Angmar is able to secure the Palantir, then the king will still need to escape. He's just escaping without the Palantir. A slight detail to be noted of. However, moving forward, this is going to be a hold ground, last stand sort of situation where the prince is trying to make sure that no forces of Angmar get past them. A very valiant, kind of heroic last stand, something that we really saw a lot of in the Defense of the North book. Moving on now to Scenario 8. The first siege of Fornost. Another siege, baby! Not only is this another siege in our campaign here, but it is now another moment where the encounter is kind of split up into two, or I would like to split it up into two. Angmar and Arnor, as expected. The template that we're looking at here is going to be between domination and capture and control. One of those two. The idea is holding out. For the standard 6 turns, Arnor just needs to remain there. They need to, make sure that their champions live or their king lives. So there's probably a little bit of a contest of champions here to also consider, while Angmar is just trying to kill their champions, trying to break them, trying to push them. In lieu of the next scenario, Círdan breaks the siege of Fornost. This scenario is kind of small, and the idea is that to give Rivendell a little bit more of the spotlight here as Círdan and his elves come in from Mithland to lift the siege off of Fornost. This battle, this confrontation is happening outside of the walls between Círdan's forces who have just arrived against the forces of Angmar who have been here fighting. So you've got the walls in the backdrop and the people of Arnor defending themselves within the walls and so forth, but it is going to be Círdan and his elves pushing against the forces of Angmar. So probably domination, probably to the death, something of that like. Scenario 10 is Over the High Pass. Over the High Pass introduces Lorien, or Lothlorien, into the conflict, as Amroth, the king of Lorien, is bringing a force of elves over the high pass of the Misty Mountains to meet up with Rivendell to plot and plan and join the fight against Angmar. In terms of the factions that take place or are present at this battle, Lorien, and then the antagonistic faction, this is my concern and my confusion, because I know in the Defense of the North, the Beornings have like 2 scenarios. It's not a whole lot that the Beornings are in, but in terms of the elements of the campaign and the narrative that would make the most sense, I think it is worth the inclusion of Lothlorien, even though their role to play might be a little bit small. So, that is a long walk to get to. I'm not entirely sure what evil faction should be present. If it should be Moria, if it should be Mordor, if it should be Goblin Town, if it should be Azog's Legion, or if it just should simply be Angmar. I think the idea that an auxiliary force that has been promised boons from the Witch King makes the most sense to try to stop the coming of the Lorien elves over the High Pass. So I'm leaning more towards the goblins. It could also be Angmar, but I think Moria makes more sense. Scenario 11 is called Put on the Back Foot. It is the combined forces of the elves of Rivendell and Lorien to push Angmar back into the territory of Angmar itself, push them out of Arnor, and really make their presence known in this conflict. The factions that are present are obviously going to be Rivendell, Lorien, and Angmar. Angmar is going to more or less be playing a reconnoiter kind of style game where they're going to be trying to run away and preserve as many of their forces as possible, whereas the elves are going to be basically trying to kill as many as they possibly can. And the importance of killing as many as you can before they get off the board edge is the next scenario, Scenario 12, which is the Siege of Carn Dûm. Carn Dûm is the capital fortress city for Angmar. It is another siege. It could be in 2 parts. but for the time being, I'm not putting it in 2 parts. My idea for it is simply that Angmar is now the ones being besieged, rather doing the sieging, and then you're going to have Contest of Champions as the kind of main scenario template that you'll be working with on this one. Just to mention, because I have alluded to it possibly being a 2-parter, is in a very similar kind of switcheroo situation to Scenario 9, where Círdan came to lift the siege of Fornost, one of the captains of Angmar could come to lift the siege on Cairn Dûm. Canonically, the end of this siege really drives the Witch King back to Cairn Dûm. The elves are like, cool, you're gonna fucking stay there. The elves do not finish the job, which is kind of what leads to the rest of the 600 years of strife. Scenario 13 is known as the Great Plague. This is a major historical moment where a Great Plague sweeps over the entirety of Arnor, coming out of Cardolan, because the corruption that the Witch King has been festering there manifests in a plague, so it is a bad time for pretty much everyone who is involved. Except for the bad guys, because they're fine. We're going to be looking at Fog of War, as well as Relic of Ages Past. Again, I really like the Relic of Ages Past scenario. I think that's really interesting. And then the Fog of War, just to give that confusion and those elements of chaos, I think is a really, really interesting scenario to play with, especially with the corruption that is happening in the Barrow Downs. This scenario, the board would more or less be kind of an area where Barrow Wights are playing a fairly heavy role. Angmar has to be looking for something to make this situation all the worse, some sort of a great spectral weapon of some kind, whereas the Arnorians would be looking for some sort of an antidote or some sort of a cure or some sort of an area that needs to be destroyed, a totem of some kind maybe, to end the Great Plague. All the way up to Scenario 14 at this point. This one I am calling Horrors from the Fallen Lands. This one is going to be obviously Angmar versus Arnor again. Angmar is going to use primarily a lot of terror-based faction units, as well as the terror of Arnor. I think this would be a great place for him to take his, front and center. Maybe some black Numenorians thrown in there as well as a heavy emphasis on the Rudar clansmen who are kind of causing terror. While Arnor is going to be more heavily based on those guys still hanging out at the Weathered Hills, smaller bands of like warriors of Arnor and rangers, as well as your Shire archers and stuff like that. By this point in the history, the Shire has been created and now have aligned themselves with the Rangers of Arnor to defend their borders. To help with that level of terror, I chose the scenario template A Clash by Moonlight, as that will kind of like help set the tone and set the mood. The forces of Angmar come in out of nowhere from multiple sides of the board, while Arnor fight off the horrors that come from the Fallen Lands. Scenario 15 is called While Cardolan Stands, It Fights. There's a reference there, and currently I don't know exactly where I got that. The idea is that these are small holdouts of Cardolan, the Rangers and the citizens, and maybe even some Rudar loyalists, who are fighting against the roaming bands of Angmar forces that are rampaging through the fallen kingdom of Cardolan. The template scenarios that we're looking at here is going to be Storm the Camp, Domination, and Fog of War. All of these elements to add a little bit of chaos to the battlefield, but also kind of put some people on the back foot. Scenario 16 is going to be called Cardolan Reclaimed, or the Reclamation of Cardolan, kind of a direct contrast to the previous scenario. This one includes King Ereval, the king of Arnor at the time, with his elven allies. So we're going to see Círdan, we might see Glorfindel, Elrond, and so forth, joining forces together to fight against Angmar, who have various, small strongholds or stuff like that. Angmar is on the defensive this time. We don't see Angmar on the defensive too often, so having a moment like this I think is very important, because Ereval is the only king who really does a great deal of good in terms of reclaiming Cardolan from the corruption and the influence of Angmar, so showcasing that moment in history I think is very important. You could probably have it where Arnor and Ereval is coming from one side of the board, Elrond and Círdan and the elves are coming from another side of the board, where Angmar is kind of held up in the center defensively to basically hold out, and the idea is that the forces of good need to break the forces of evil, and once the forces of evil have broken, get them off the board. Scenario 17 starts our climax here of this entire campaign, and this one is definitely a scenario and an encounter that will be broken up into multiple pieces. Very similar to the Defense of the North and the Siege of Erebor. That entire situation was broken up into multiple different pieces, and I really like that because it was talking about various different moments in the siege. And so the Siege of Fornost is going to basically do the same thing in a number of different ways. The idea here is that this is the final siege. This is the moment where the Witch King brings all of his forces to bear and will stop at nothing to completely destroy Fornost and the Arnorian power structure. And the basic idea and premise of this scenario, this first scenario, scenario 17, the primary siege, is going to be Angmar breaking through the walls of Fornost. From here, we move on to the more cinematic moments. We have a smaller encounter, which is the people rise up. This is a very heavy emphasis on the citizens of Arnor, them rising up in the face of doom in their city and picking up whatever they can, whether it is weapons, whether it is farming equipment, whether it is simple rocks, to defend themselves against the tides of the shadow alongside what small garrisons of soldiers they have left. Very much a hold ground to the death, last man standing, in a heroic final stand of the people of Arnor. Followed by Scenario 19, which is the Marshal's last stand. This scenario specifically would be another pocket situation where the people are rising up in one side, the Marshal is on another side of the city. For this one, you're trying to get citizens out of the city and out of the situation. The citizens start in the middle of the board, the Marshal starts at one end of the board, the Angmar faction starts at another end of the board. The idea is for the Marshal and his forces to get to the center of the board to allow the citizens of Arnor to escape through him, and as long as they get out, then he can have a heroic death. Which takes us to Scenario 20. Scenario 20 is Rudour's Redemption, is what I'm calling it. Arvedui and his guards is making a push to the final defense at the steps of the palace. And so we have this Rudour loyalist chieftain, from a thematic standpoint and a narrative standpoint, would still be looked at as the people who betrayed Arnor. They would be seen as the reason why Arnor is in such a sticky situation. So to have a moment here where loyalist chieftain and his men cover the king's rear so citizens can escape and basically hold out as a sort of redemption for the ills of their forebears, I think it's very thematic, I think it's very evocative, and I think would be a really fun scenario. The final confrontation. This scenario takes place on the steps of the Palace of Fornost. It is Arvedui and his guards as the forces of Angmar throw themselves against him. Angmar is trying to kill Arvedui. The scenario ends when Arvedui dies. Now, Scenario 22 does take place at the very tail end of the Siege of Fornost. It is more or less an homage to the opening of the Aeneid. The Aeneid is one of my favorite epic poems. But I wanted to give a moment of that as a small band of refugees trying to get away with the king's crown, with the scepter, because these refugees and their flight is going to take them to Gondor, which is going to lead into the definitive end of this campaign, which is Arnor calls for aid. Scenario 23 is the battle that includes Rivendell and Gondor against the forces of Angmar. Gondor is coming to basically avenge the fallen kingdom of Arnor, whereas the elves are finishing what they started when they sacked Carn Dûm. Contest of Champions, Dominion, all of these different things that we could throw in there to end the confrontation. And that's the campaign. Honorable mentions should be made to the proverbial 24th scenario where the King of Gondor, Arnor, the last King of Gondor, chases after the Witch King of Angmar, and then Arnor never returns, leading to the whole dissolution of the Arnor country, Gondor falling into the line of stewards, everything that sets up the state of affairs that Middle-earth is in come the time of the War of the Ring and the Lord of the Rings. Another honorable mention should be given to an extra scenario that would involve Khand and Gondor. During the Great Plague, canonically, there's a moment where Gondor musters an army to go and assist and lend support to Arnor, but they are stopped and held off by the Wayne Riders of Khand, and there's this whole combat that happens. They're taken unawares, and they are only aided by the forebears of the Rohirrim, or the people who would become the Rohirrim. I do believe it's the Edain. An honorable mention should be made to that potential scenario, probably being an extra one. The way that they do in some of the books have extra scenarios seemed more appropriate, but that is ostensibly the campaign. The narrative campaign element of MESBG seems like the strongest element of the game. The reason why I really like to play these games, as I alluded to earlier, is those elements of narrative investment. The themes of this campaign are deeply entrenched in bravery and courage in the face of annihilation, doomed to die, the last stand, all of these pseudo grimdark themes being shown in MESBG, I think would be a very evocative campaign, which is why I put all the effort into thinking about it. God. But at this point, I think I should probably wrap up. I am wore out. Those are the units, that's the campaign. Obviously, one of the big things that comes to us in MESBG through all of the different supplements are going to be the various legendary legions. And though I could really expand on what I would want to see, I still do not have the experience really with the legendary legions. I think a legendary legion for Arnor would really kind of fit the way that Arnor already is meant to be played. For Angmar, it would be something akin to really banking on the terror rules. And then for the elves, just kind of a big host of elves that are here to really, you know, fuck shit up and not finish the job. That aspect of the game is still something that I am very new to, so I'm not really confident in doing a deep dive on what I would really like to see in that respect. Eventually, I'll get there. The War with Angmar and the fallout therein really sets the groundwork for the setting of Middle-earth by the time that Bilbo finds the ring. It can be considered a catalyst for the events of what we would know as the Lord of the Rings. It establishes the Shire, it establishes the power of the Shadow's servants, it establishes the circumstances for Aragorn. It is, in my opinion, one of the most impactful moments in the Legendarium. And I really just think it's so cool. So that is what I would like to see and why I would like to see it. I want to give a huge shout out and thank you to Too Many Minis for starting the thinking about this video, and for all of the other content creators in the MESBG space that have influenced me and encouraged me to join this community that I have been putting off for far too long. Like I said earlier, this video has been a journey, but I'm ready to now put this journey to bed, and thank you so much for hanging out with me for this extended diatribe about what I would like to see in the next supplement for MESBG. If you have any thoughts, I would love to hear them in the comments below. If you enjoyed the video, don't hesitate to hit the buttons downstairs that everyone else bugs you about. We would love for you to join the discussion at the lunch table. I am still waiting on that ramen. Peace out, friends.